Right, so while we continue to observe Israeli atrocity day after day with seemingly nothing changing, they carry on regardless, and those who would defend them continue to do so. The moment someone comes along and upsets their little apple cart, though, their contentment in where they stand on all things Israeli, my goodness, do they suddenly start shouting and crying and slinging their toys out of the pram over it. The demands that such a person who would shine a light on their grotesque shortcomings be allowed to speak. The attacks upon their character that come, the accusations of racism fired their way, coming from people who are defending a lethal form of racism themselves, as we have seen all too often done for years now, but most notably in recent times since October the 7th of last year. But the person they're attacking on this occasion couldn't give a damn about what others have to say about her. She's got a job to do. She's going to do that job, and she's going to call out those responsible, and given that an attack on her is again an attack on the United Nations itself, they really should be getting people around the world asking what the heck is wrong with those doing the attacking, given the UN, regardless of your view on their usefulness, are still a representative body of global political interest. No one country or group of countries is bigger than them. So an attack on them can only ever be seen as an attack on what is right and what is just. So the latest round of attacks on a UN special rapporteur, as this has been, should be condemned by us all. But given who this particular rapporteur is, she doesn't really need us to defend her because she can body her critics well enough without any help from us.
And frankly, I'm shocked. I always experience a sense of shock and delusion when I come to this room, because many of you recited the same script that you had in front of yourself last year. Of course, we condemn Hamas attack. Of course, we express solidarity with the Israeli victims. Of course, we demand the release of the hostages, both the Israelis and the Palestinians. But is it possible that after 42,000 people killed, you cannot empathize with the Palestinians? Those of you who have not uttered a word about what is happening in Gaza, demonstrate that empathy has evaporated from this room. And empathy is the glue that makes us stand united as humanity. But don't worry, you can continue and you will become more and more irrelevant to the rest of the world, which is in turmoil. And it's not just the global south. Look at the young people in Europe, in Western countries, those to whom many of you, including my own country and Germany and France and the UK, are demonstrating that human rights are good to be taught in schools and universities. But don't dare you trying to exercise freedom of assembly and freedom of expressions in your street, all the more for Palestine, all the more touching our ally Israel. This is what you are telling young generations.
Right, so that was, of course, UN Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territories, Francesca Albanese, speaking at the United Nations this week, and pretty much handing several of those in attendance their backsides on a plate, calling out those still defending the genocide of the apartheid regime of Israel, and how they will be remembered, how they are being viewed by the rest of the world, and the next generation of their own people. And given that the UN is based in the US, well, their headquarters are, you can't help but feel this was a message being directed at them. But not exclusively so. She looked around the room, having heard what they'd recently been saying, and accused them of repeating the same script in front of them as they had had last year, what they were saying exactly the same last year, as if the subsequent deaths of some 43,000 people in Gaza since October 7th, 2023 hadn't actually happened, or didn't actually matter, because despite the scale of those deaths, in their minds and in their rhetoric, nothing has changed. And she's right, because it hasn't. Israel is carrying on, armed still, as it mostly is, by the US, without any real intention of that changing, regardless of which of the two empathy-deficient fools running for president right now get elected to that post as the US go to the polls next week. Albanese made the important point, as always has to be made, of condemning Hamas for the events of October 7th, because if you don't do that first, before criticising Israel, you get accused of supporting them by default, get accused of being an anti-Semite as a result, and get accused of supporting terrorism. Despite Albanese clearly having made that distinction in that video clip and on many occasions previously, she still gets accused of such. But sometimes the brass neck of those accusations is just too much to bear. And it would be remiss of me to not point out a particular tweet in relation to Albanese's visit to the US, to speak to the United Nations, made by the US ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield. You may not recognise the name, though I'm sure if you've watched the UN Security Council veto sanctions on Israel, you'll recognise the face, because the sheer nerve of this woman's attack on Albanese was just too on the nose to simply take. She tweeted out, "As UN Special Rapporteur Albanese visits New York, I want to reiterate the US belief she is unfit for her role. The United Nations should not tolerate anti-Semitism from a UN-affiliated official hired to promote human rights." As opposed to tolerating yourself raising your goddamn hand every single time Israel faces censure at the UN Security Council then. As you can imagine, Twitter very much had plenty to say to Thomas Greenfield, but the best response easily came from the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention, a US non-profit which has grown out of a focus on preventing genocide happening again in Iraq to a more global mandate to combat genocide. So with that in mind, they had words for the ambassador, and they said, "Your attack on UN Special Rapporteur Albanese is so clearly intended to hide your criminal complicity in an ongoing genocide that you truly should be embarrassed. Is there any trick from the genocidaire's playbook that you will refuse to carry out? By attacking a person who is courageously speaking truth, you obviously hope to draw attention away from the criminal conspiracy that is the Biden White House, State Department of Defense, and your office, all of which have materially aided Israel in committing genocide. Francesca Albanese is an upstander. She'll be remembered as a hero. You will be remembered as a perpetrator and an apologist. As experts on the crime of genocide, we can say this with certainty." There's a burn worthy of the ones Albanese dishes out herself, quite frankly. But it wasn't the only one, because while she addressed the UN on her visit to the US, to the disgust of certain ambassadors clearly, the Biden administration blocked Albanese's also planned speech to address Congress, because apparently they're too scared to hear the consequences of their ongoing support for genocide. A genocide which they could stop with a phone call. A genocide they could stop if they just cut the arms supplies immediately. A genocide that could not go on without them. Too scared to hear the truth, the ramifications of their actions. But as always seems to be the case, the supportive media are the ones who provided cover for the politicians and gave those same politicians the excuse to cancel her address, as this excerpt from Middle East Monitor explains. American author and human rights activist Medea Benjamin shared a video expressing frustration at Congress, with Albanese noting that her report highlighted Israel's crimes against Gaza, questioning the US role in undermining 75 years of progress in international law. Francesca Albanese was going to talk to us about her new report of what Israel is doing in Gaza, and we were very excited about it. We had a lot of RSVPs for it, and then suddenly yesterday there was an article that came out in the Jewish Insider that started talking about the accusations in the Biden administration about the Special Rapporteur being anti-Semitic, she said. She added, "Now this is crazy. You can label anybody anti-Semitic who is faulting Israel for the slaughter that it's doing, but they're not anti-Semitic. And Francesca Albanese is not anti-Semitic, but because of that article, the representative who was hosting us here got scared. He said he was getting calls from higher-ups, which we assume is higher up in the Democratic Party, that pressured him to cancel this briefing." Benjamin further called for open congressional discourse on US support in Gaza. "It is outrageous," she said. "We have got to open up this Congress to the voices of reason and to the voices of truth if we're ever going to get a US policy that stops supporting genocide." Benjamin hits the nail on the head. Anyone can be called anti-Semitic, and God knows we know they do, and we know that especially here in the UK all too well. But it's an accusation, an insult that has lost all of its meaning, all of its power. The term has been so abused to assault anyone who is critical of Israel, which of course is not anti-Semitic at all, that it has done untold damage to combating the real thing. And so afraid were Congress to hear the consequences of their actions that it was an awfully conveniently timed article by Jewish Insider covering what the Biden administration were apparently saying about Albanese, which of course was going to be detrimental to that speech continuing and actually happening. It's literally her job to point out how the US administration is allowing the continuity of this genocide, how it is enabling it, and they don't want to hear it because they don't want to stop. But neither is Albanese going to stop. She's just published a 32-page report on the situation regarding the human rights of the people of Palestine, titled "Genocide as Colonial Erasure," and although I highly recommend reading the whole thing, her recommendations at the end are absolutely damning, and it's little wonder US Congress really couldn't bear the thought of listening to it. The current genocide is part of a century-long project of eliminatory settler colonialism in Palestine, a stain on the international system and humanity, which must be ended, investigated and prosecuted. The Special Rapporteur reminded all states of their legal obligation to act on their due diligence duties, given the clearly serious risk of continuous breach of the Genocide Convention and Geneva Conventions, and urges states to consider and reach an urgent public determination as to what levers and tools each state has at its disposal to ameliorate that risk, whether acting alone or with states, including at the United Nations, and to explain to the public and the international community the steps which it has taken and why. Whether in compliance with the above due diligence duties or otherwise, the Special Rapporteur urges Member States to A. Use all their political leverage, commencing with a full arms embargo and sanctions, so that Israel stops the assault against the Palestinians, accepts a ceasefire, and fully withdraws from the occupied Palestinian territory in line with the ICJ advisory opinion of the 19th of July 2024. B. Formally recognise Israel as an apartheid state and persistent violator of international law, reactivating the Special Committee Against Apartheid to comprehensively address the situation in Palestine, and warn Israel of possible suspension of its membership under Article 6 of the Charter of the United Nations. C. Support the deployment of an international protective presence throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. D. Develop a protective framework for Palestinians displaced outside Gaza in line with international humanitarian rights and refugee law, while fully preserving their right to return. E. Support independent and thorough investigations of criminal conduct, including genocide and apartheid, including through the application in national courts of universal jurisdiction over those suspected of such criminal conduct, including all relevant ancillary agencies and offences. F. Investigate and prosecute corporate entities and dual citizens involved in crimes in the occupied Palestinian territory, including soldiers, mercenaries and settlers. G. Ensure unhindered humanitarian assistance to Gaza and full financing and protection of UNRWA, including from attacks on its premises and personnel and from libelous smear campaigns, and ensure the continuity of its mandate in all fields. The Special Rapporteur urges the ICC prosecutor to investigate the commission of the crimes of genocide and apartheid by Israel and investigate other prominent individuals mentioned in the present report. The Special Rapporteur urges the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, to investigate the broader context of eliminatory intent and practices of Israel against all Palestinians, triple lens test, including those with Israeli citizenship and the refugees, and recent acts of genocide. It's easy to see why pro-Israel interests are so afraid of Albanese when she has got their number lock, stock and barrel. Which is why they attack her and accuse her of being a racist, of course. But equally, how little she gives a damn about their fears too. People need to know what is going on, and she's doing her best to make sure that people do know. You just might have to look for it a bit, given the state of Western media. Meanwhile, Israel are themselves attacking the UN via their ban on UNRWA and ongoing attacks on UNIFIL peacekeepers. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.